This podcast was recorded 2 weeks ago. At the time of this recording, George Floyd was alive and the nation was yet to erupt in protests over the systemic indifference to Black and brown lives. Therefore, this episode does not include a discussion of these incredibly important protests. However, the issues discussed are part of a centuries-old narrative that devalues Black and brown lives. This narrative defines the America at the center of these protests. Our hearts are with communities impacted by an unequal system of justice and those resisting injustice in the nation's streets and courtrooms.
Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast with Jonathan Rapping. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense.
So that intro was phenomenal. And if those of you in the listening audience didn't know, that is the co-founder of Gideon's Promise and also my wife, Illy, who is doing that intro. And I'm sure that anything I say is only going to go downhill from there. But I've got to say, this is really exciting for me. This is the first taping. I was hoping that all of our guests could get together because we're all a little tired of communicating virtually. So I just want you all to imagine Raj and Scott and Josie, as well as hopefully what will be millions of people in our listening audience. Imagine that we're all packed into my living room. You've got your coffee, your tea, whatever. And we are just kind of kicking it. So I want to start.
Yeah, I am not right now in my car, which is the only safe space for my 4.5-year-old who won't jump on my phone during a Zoom call. I'm not right now in my car.
You're not, Scott. You're in my living room. You're in my living room. So we founded Gideon's Promise, the organization, 13 years ago because we really believe public defenders were the key to transforming criminal justice in our nation's most dysfunctional systems. We're launching Gideon's Promise, the podcast, because although as the nation has finally turned its attention to criminal justice reform a few years ago, public defenders have largely been left out of that national conversation. I know all of us on the call, criminal justice reform advocates nationally, have cheered over the last few years as reformers have turned to bail reform and sentencing reform, decriminalization of the least serious misbehavior, electing prosecutors who are less punitive. All of that is really important. But I think what we also all recognize is that public defenders have been ignored. And at Gideon's Promise, we understand that all of these reforms need public defenders to succeed. There are lots of people who see the value of public defenders in individual cases, in courtrooms, but the folks who are joining us today on this podcast were selected because it's a group of people who really understand that public defenders play a much more significant role in the ongoing struggle for justice beyond courtrooms. And I'd be remiss not to note that we're having this first podcast in the midst of a pandemic. And that pandemic really only highlights even more that we're in a system that really doesn't value so many lives. And public defenders now more than ever find themselves pushing actors in the system, judges, prosecutors, to see folks as human beings. And that takes a real emotional and physical toll on public defenders who are doing that every day. So I want to start by just giving a shout out to those first responders, those public defenders, tell them we love them. And today we're going to talk about why they're indispensable to justice. So I'm going to turn to our guests, who are three people who I most admire in this space. The first, my good friend Raj Jayadev, who is a community organizer from San Jose, founder of Silicon Valley Debug, a storytelling, community organizing, and advocacy organization. He's also the visionary behind Participatory Defense, a community organizing model to give communities power in the criminal justice system, used to foster alliances between public defenders and the people and communities they serve. Along with Raj, Scott Hechinger, who was a public defender for nearly a decade in Brooklyn, co-founder of the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. He's pioneered the use of traditional as well as social media advocacy to really amplify the defender perspective and to lift up the voices of the people that public defenders serve. And he also founded and directs Zealous, a national initiative to activate, train, and support public defenders to move their advocacy outside of the courtroom. And then finally, Josie Duffy Rice. And I've actually known Josie since she was in high school when I first moved here with my family, and we stayed with her best friend's parents. But I've had the great privilege of watching her develop into a real leader in the criminal justice space. She's a president of The Appeal, a digital platform that amplifies stories about criminal justice. She's the host of Justice in America, a podcast that features leading voices in the criminal justice arena. And it was recently nominated for a Webby Award, which is an award for like the bombest stuff on the internet. So kudos to you for that, Josie. And I actually think it's kind of interesting that I'm hosting a podcast where you're the guest, because this is really role reversal.
That is true. You were one of our original Justice in America guests.
Yes. It really shot my career up tremendously. So I appreciate that opportunity. But I'm excited to be with you all. And
Credit where credit's due.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. It's all me.
It's all you, Josie. So I want to start out. I want to throw out a question for all of you. And Raj, I'll start with you. And the question is, why do you have love for public defenders, and why are they so critical in this struggle for justice?
Sure, Rap. And I mean, I appreciate being in your living room, having coffee with you three, virtually at least. And I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a community organizer, and I'd have to admit that I did not have any sort of inherent love or cheerleading capacity for public defenders. All I knew was that I was a community organizer that wanted to do what we could to flex power, to stop incarceration, to stop police brutality, to stop people being sent to prison and torn away from our community. And when it came down to where the real work was happening and who was actually doing the real work, the battlefield was the court, and the people that were fighting that battle were public defenders. So when it came down to people that we loved and what was the forces that they had, the weaponry that they had to challenge institutions of the court, judges, prosecutors, mandatory sentences, the ally was public defenders. So from almost like a practical standpoint, it came down to if we wanted freedom for our communities, the most important character that was now in our lives was the public defender. We needed to make sure they were as refined and precise and impactful as possible. But then once we started occupying the courts and going with families and communities into court, we found that all the things that like our larger movement has been pushing for, like the stuff you mentioned, like bail reform and prosecutorial accountability and police accountability, those were like major fights that kind of feel abstract at times that public defenders fight every single day in like a morning hearing. So when it comes down to where the actual fight is proximate and who the proximate fighters are, to me, it's public defenders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've got to say, Raj, I give you so much credit for your work helping public defenders in the communities they serve recognize they're really allies in this struggle. And there are oftentimes in many places or sometimes walls built between public defenders and the communities. And I think your work has gone so far towards breaking those walls down. I also was remiss in not mentioning that your vision has earned you a Macarthur Genius Award recently. And so we're grateful for that. You're a genius, Raj, in my living room.
Yeah, I know all that. But.
Scott, we're the only two people on this call that don't have MacArthur Genius Awards. So I think we got to catch up, you know?
I'm extremely intimidated and also entirely not worthy of a MacArthur Genius Award. We gotta put in decades more work and actually be geniuses first. But I think maybe we'll get there, Josie, someday. But we're in the presence of geniuses for sure, and honored to be here.
Some people,
y'all are geniuses to us. So.
Yeah, some people don't need outside recognition for everyone to know they're geniuses. But Scott, let me throw that same question at you. Why do you have love for public defenders? You've been one for years, and why are they so critical to the struggle for justice?
Oh, I got love for public defenders because they're the funniest, best humored, caring, empathetic, smart, brutally honest, intense, and passionate people I've ever encountered. I mean, and from the very beginning, when I first met a public defender, really, or came in contact with them, my first law job in law school, between first and second year of law school, I headed down to New Orleans. I was in either the first or second intern class down there. There was no public defender office before Katrina. It was right after Katrina. And a lot of amazing public defenders came kind of crashing down into Louisiana to shake things up a bit. And I remember some of the images that stick with me is Scott, one of the supervisors of the office, getting dragged out literally in handcuffs from court day after day. I'm saying it was probably every other day for simply making legal arguments. I remember one time making the argument that the idea of sentencing someone to life without parole for the fourth time marijuana conviction was absolutely ludicrous, and kind of challenging the court. So just doing the basic things we kind of imagine happens in court. Public defenders face enormous challenge. I remember down there in Barksdale, sitting in the witness box in the magistrate courtroom, looking through a video conference of a mass arraignment with about 100 orange jumpsuits with indiscernible black faces, and getting cut off by the judge when he was trying to make simple bail arguments that not everyone should automatically have bail set. And then kind of moving forward through the experience, I did a federal defender clinic and was fortunate enough to work with folks like Deirdre and Phil, who I remember standing next to a young man, a teenager who was just, while he was getting sentenced to life, and putting their arms around him and seeing and feeling that they had this deeper connection with this person. And that person knew that he was not alone in that moment. And then fast forward to working at Brooklyn Defender Services, and I think about Debbie filing the same motion against the same to get information out about these same crooked cops 5 times in a row, and finally winning. What I love about public defenders, but also what is so critical to the struggle for humanity, the struggle for justice, is that public defenders are on the ground every day in extraordinarily unfriendly environments, yet bring a fight, bring a resilience, bring humanity to the people who are going through the process, complicate narratives, make people jump off the pages of just another, people v. so-and-so's name, charged with the same thing that everyone is.
Josie, why do you have love for public defenders? Talk to me.
It's interesting because as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking about the fact that you might be the first public defender I ever met. As you mentioned, I met you years ago when I was in high school, in the Greens living room, and it really sticks out in my mind because I thought that law school sounded interesting, and you said you went to law school, and I was like, I'm never gonna get there. And now somehow all these years have passed.
And you graduated from law school I couldn't get into.
They would have let you in my year. It was an easy year. But after I left college, I left during the middle of the recession and couldn't really find a job. And a friend of mine emailed me and said, there's a position open at Bronx Defenders. You could be the assistant to the executive director. At the time was Robin Steinberg, and you should apply. I always say after I tell this story that I was a horrible assistant, and I would like to publicly apologize to Robin if she's listening, because being an assistant turns out to not play to my skills whatsoever. But it was a year of the most life-changing experience for me. I didn't really understand anything about the criminal justice system at the time, and I certainly did not have, a complicated narrative of the role that defense attorneys played. And especially public defenders. That year changed my life, and it really did make me realize that the work that public defenders do is God's work, right? The criminal justice system asks a person in a defendant's chair to stand up against the entire power of the state and defend themselves. That's what it does. I mean, that's the system we've set up. It is the state, it is the people, supposedly, against one person. And public defenders are warriors, right? In that battle, they stand there with someone who doesn't have the resources or the power or the skills often to fight back against a system that wants them incarcerated, that wants them punished. That doesn't care about them, and they fight for that person. I don't know that there's any more noble work that anybody could do. And it has been such a journey in my work. So much of my work is on the on the battlefield against the other side, just systemically, policy-wise, in terms of media, against prosecutors. And every single time we talk about a prosecutor who has flouted the rules, who has been too harsh, who has harmed so many people, we are getting those stories. We are learning these things from public defenders who are in the courtroom. We are learning those things from the people who play this role of protector and of warrior and of storyteller. I wanted to be a public defender. It turned out I wasn't particularly great at being a lawyer, so I moved to being a journalist. But there is nobody I admire more, and there's been no one kind of career or occupation that has shifted my own view of the world, not just the criminal justice system, but the world, more than public defenders have.
Wow, that's. I'm glad I asked you that question. I'm sorry it took so many years for me to do that. I wonder if, given your perspectives, you could share your thoughts about what to me is a really hard question to answer. Why is it that public defenders have been left out of this national reform conversation as issues like bail reform and sentencing reform and progressive prosecution have gained so much traction? And why have public defenders been ignored?
I would, I think I see this coming from a couple of different ways. So there's sort of the advocacy work, and then there's also the media work. I will say that from the media perspective, what public defenders face, and we talked a lot about this at the conference in the fall for Zealous, what public defenders face is a really uphill battle when it comes to the media for a couple of reasons. The first is that journalism is strapped, right? It's always been in a pretty rough state, but it's currently, someone put it recently, fighting for both its life and for its soul. And journalists don't have often the resources to, or even the knowledge base to talk to all the parties involved in a case. And I'm particularly talking about local journalists. The system is set up, especially when it comes to the media, in a way that in a way that directs all the attention in a case, and in any sort of criminal case, and anytime any sort of crime happening towards law enforcement. So if you're reporting on, let's say, a car break-in, you call the police for a statement, and maybe you call the prosecutor for a statement, and you are always calling these people, right? You're constantly in touch with them. You need them. You don't want to piss them off. You don't want to anger them. You don't want to leave them out of the story. And so often what we do is we take law enforcement's narrative as fact, as unimpeachable, and we never think about who else we should be talking to. So on some level, on the media side, we are a law enforcement obsessed culture, right? We are inherently trusting of law enforcement and have been for decades. And we believe that these people would not, will always have the truth. And so we've left public defenders so largely out of the conversation when it comes to in the media, in part because we have not seen them as crucial as reporters. And that, I think, comes from a lack of knowledge about what is a fairly opaque system. In terms of advocacy, look, like people like enemies, right? It's this criminal justice fight reflects in many ways what we've all been fighting against too, right? Which is the need to have a bad guy, the need to have an enemy. It is easier to motivate people when you have an enemy. And that's not to say that many of the enemies that I'm referencing, bad law enforcement, police officers that are inflicting police brutality, and prosecutors that are too harsh, and the cheating, lying people in the system, they are enemies, right? But you're fighting a much different fight when you're fighting for something versus against something. And I think that's something that everybody in advocacy and everybody on a lot of different issues has to battle, is how do we lift up public defenders and how do we focus more on the aspect of public defense when it's frankly much easier, not much necessarily much easier, but much more instinctual to push against and to push back and to fight the bad guy. And I don't know that we figured that out quite yet.
So Raj, you have really, I think, taught public defenders across the nation to reframe their role, to see themselves as really an instrument that impacted communities use in this fight against a dehumanizing, unjust system. Given your belief that public defenders are a critical instrument, why is it that they've largely been left out of the broader discussion about justice reform?
What we say is, when folks are facing a charge or their loved ones are facing a charge, it feels like this fight or this struggle of biblical proportions. And we say it's the David versus Goliath moment for a lot of families. And it doesn't matter, quite frankly, if it's a life exposure case, a misdemeanor, juvenile, or whatever. It is the most anxiety-filled struggle that people often have ever have to face. And, it takes a lot of courage to muster up the strength to say that I'm going to fight against this powerful entity of the state and entrenched racism and mandatory minimum sentences. And so they acknowledge that the fight is of that epic proportion, but they often see themselves rightly characterized as David, the warrior that's fighting the righteous struggle, and they see Goliath that they have to take down. The issue that we've seen is that oftentimes Goliath is perceived as whoever brings the news. And so sometimes they see themselves as a fight against the public defender versus against the prosecutor, the judge, or the mandatory minimum sentences and institutional racism. And so what we say is, look, this is still a David versus Goliath fight of biblical proportions. And you, the community, are still David. The public defender still has a role or sort of character to play in this story, but they are the weapon of David. They're the sling of David that takes down Goliath, that the community uses as a weapon to challenge that enormous power of the state. And that kind of recalibration as to what the respective role is of the attorney, and how in a lot of ways they are an extension of the movement, and how the community and the movement could use public defenders to fight for freedom is a way that they could build some bridges that otherwise were not inherently there. And if anything, I'd say were by design brought down. And I mean, so to kind of bring it back to how this even happened, like, I feel like public defenders, for very correct reasons, have been sort of insular in their fight. So, like I was saying earlier, all the things that communities across the country are marching for, are holding rallies for, are kind of bringing up this whole new energy of consciousness. That is literally what public defenders are fighting for in the courthouses that people drive by every day. And it's just on a Wednesday afternoon or a Thursday morning. And so the fact that public defenders are not part of this outer atmosphere discussion of what racial justice means and how to achieve it, I think is probably the biggest blind spot of our current larger movement. And I think part of the reason why public defenders haven't been part of this discussion, doesn't automatically come up in conversation, is because public defenders are so insular as they're trying to protect sort of the sort of privacies of the client. Is left a vacuum in the public imagination of what public safety means and how to fight for it, and what justice means and how to fight for it. And there are DA offices, there are police departments that have taken advantage of that vacuum, of that space. They've occupied that space to reframe it, like Josie said, as to who is the quote-unquote good guy and who is the quote-unquote bad guy. The intentionality and the power of controlling the narrative is something that I think has been absent in the conversation around public defense. And it's also the reason why I think the stuff that like Scott's doing with Zealous and what Josie's doing in Appeal is so seismically important, because it shifts the entire imagination of how this story plays out.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and Scott, both Raj and Josie talked about the role that public defenders have in sort of making sure things that are going uncovered in the system are revealed. No one does that really, I think, more creatively than you do. Why do you think public defenders are sort of left out of this conversation?
I think the reason why public defenders have been overlooked, is there's a variety of reasons, both self-inflicted and imposed from the outside. One, as Josie and Raj mentioned, there's this countervailing narrative that's reinforced by the media time and time again in movies, in local stories, in other forms of press, that public defenders are lazy, uncaring, blundering, nothing free can be quality. It's like kind of become like almost a joke. It's this perception of public defenders, or this portrayal of them, is essential to that media narrative and to movies, as the idea that everyone gets a trial, and people are only convicted after their case has been heard by a jury of their peers, who then go back and deliberate, and that a judgment is entered. And that obviously couldn't be further from the truth. 95% of convictions come from guilty pleas. And the reason why they come from guilty pleas is not because public defenders are doing a bad job. It's because of the forces at play that create a coercive environment. What this leads to is, folks who we represent in their communities also viewing us in this light. That is also partnered with one of the things I mentioned earlier, which is that we don't always win, but it's not because we're not fighting. It's not because we're making valid argument. It's not because we're zealous in court. It's because of the systems that are set up to devastate the people who we represent. On the other hand, you've got people in power. So from media, but also to the leaders who are in position to make the decisions that have an impact on the people who defenders represent. And they too have traditionally viewed, and up to present, view public defenders often as crazy abolitionists who just want to get people out. And it's true that we want to shrink the system. We want to decarcerate. We want to make the system fairer. And that takes really major transformative thinking and a change in the status quo. But it's not just to get people out. It's actually a way to not only enhance justice, but it's also a way to make the public safer. It's also a way to help heal the trauma of survivors of crime. So what can we do? There's these those are kind of imposed challenges from the outside. And one of the self-inflicted wounds that we often end up with is I'm concerned and kind of talking to folks around the country that we've started sometimes to believe this all too much ourselves, right? It's seeped into the psyche of the public defender community that our roles stop and start at the doorhouse of the courtroom. What if we could kind of harness the potential of this, these thousands and thousands of criminal justice champions? What if we could work together to think about a way to engage with the press in a way that's both ethical, but also ensures that our perspective on what's wrong with the system, but perhaps just as critically, maybe even more critically, the people we represent as partners in this fight are heard as well. How can we get to that point where journalists are listening to us when leaders aren't just dismissing our voices as crazy, aren't just, when there's 400 of us in a room and one prosecutor comes in and says they're all wrong, going with the prosecutor. And I think what that takes is, deep narrative shifting within our own ranks, within the public defender ranks, to then work together to kind of collectively shift the narrative, not just about the system as a whole, but of public defenders' role in it, who we are, and what kind of system we want to see.
We're in the midst of a global pandemic, and that pandemic has really unearthed in significant ways just how cruel and unjust and unequal this system is. And public defenders really have shown themselves to be first responders in that pandemic. And I wonder if you all, I know all of you, have been thinking about the role of public defenders and the people they serve during this pandemic. Could you each share your thoughts on the role public defenders and the communities they're in alliance with have played during this pandemic that really sort of warrant a shout out and some applause? Let me see. Let me start with you, Raj.
Yeah, no, I'd love to lift up the public defenders, particularly here in Santa Clara County, because I've been seeing firsthand how very quietly, with no fanfare, they've not just been first responders, they've just been heroic in trying to save people's lives and have succeeded in that. And I think it is like emblematic of how public defenders move, even when there's not a pandemic. I mean, public defenders have always been first responders. So when a crisis hits, call it a pandemic, call it a looming incarceration, the first people that react and respond to protect others have been public defenders. That's like their whole vocation. And so I think in some ways their instincts kicked in to respond the way they did during this crisis, when a lot of us were kind of on our heels, unsure how to have impact and how to move. So what I've seen is at a time when most people were shutting it all down, putting themselves, very, for health reasons, locking themselves in their apartments and their homes, public defenders were still going to jails. They're still going to court, advocating for the rights and the freedoms of their clients because they knew they're stuck in petri dishes that could cost them their lives. What I've seen that mean is quite literally families are together who otherwise would have been separated and in the dark. And I could say why that means so much, even outside of just the possibility of an outbreak, is that when families have loved ones that are arrested right now during this period, there's no jail visit. And there's also, at least where I'm at, no public court. And so what that means is if the state takes your loved one, you don't know anything about what's happening to them. You don't see them. And so the only sense that you have that they may be okay and there may be a way home has been about the ability and capacity and willingness of public defenders. And they have not turned their backs. They've shown up. They've risked their own lives, quite frankly, to do that. I've been at court when the courts were shut down and you had public defenders in masks in front of court that were handing information to people that were trying to go to court for a loved one to say, okay, the court's been postponed. Here's information. Here's a phone number. Let's talk. I mean, literally kind of doing case diagnostics out in front of the courthouse just to protect people. And they're also going into jails. And then when we got our courts closed down, everyone else said, okay, let's just wait for things to open up. But what that means is people were caught in jail and their constitutional rights were being denied to even have their day in court. It was public defenders that pressed the court through litigation to reopen the court so people could get hearings. And, you know, one of the other things that I'd say, and Rap, I apologize if I'm talking too long, but I am really excited about what they're doing is there is sort of this national sort of self-congratulatory position that we have been decarcerating and we've saturated the amount of people we can let out. And it's what the system feels is palatable, is based on charges, and it's letting people that have more serious allegations really to face potential death sentences in jails and prisons. The people who have been pushing back against that narrative, literally in contested hearings and motions, but also publicly in the press, have been public defenders that say, you just because of a certain allegation or a certain charge, you shouldn't be confined to a place where you could die from this pandemic. When we were outside of jail, receiving people that were coming out to a world that said the only way you survive this thing is if you self-isolate and you could take care of yourself by yourself, were public defenders out in the front that were giving out hygiene material, essential information, letting them know that they're not alone as they enter this COVID world. They didn't do that. They're just volunteering to do that because they know the reality, and I think they're seeing their role as essential in a larger sense of the folks who are going to be denied justice and denied the liberty and denied the possibility of survival are their clients, and so they've really stepped up. I mean, they're making homemade sanitizers at the office. They're going to the homeless encampments. When all said and done, the folks who I think have stepped up really more than anyone through this pandemic, in my view, has been public defenders.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, like public defenders, they're already, it's one of the most urgent jobs. Everything is always go, go, go because it's life or death. All I can say is that that the public defenders that I've been in touch with throughout the country, one of the great things about working on Zealous and is being able to coordinate with a range of folks, being able to talk with them, has been just stepping up and busier and more urgent than ever before. I mean, I think that you see defenders, fighting for freedom and public health. Raj mentioned these petri dishes. Lacey Duzat in East Baton Rouge, where there isn't any
GP
access
alum?
to counsel at first appearances. She's
GP alum, Scott?
Oh yes, Gideon's Promise alum. Much love for Rap and the work that you and Illy have been doing over the years. GP alum. There's no access to counsel in first appearances in Louisiana. There's money for a pilot program that she's been the only attorney in all of East Baton Rouge for the last year working to get people out. She single-handedly has gained the release of 850 people in 1 month. And in the midst of all that, Louisiana is being forced to furlough hundreds of public defenders because of user pay, the system where public defenders are funded based upon the traffic tickets and court costs and fees of the people who they represent. She's, in addition to fighting in court still to release more people, leading and helping lead the effort around the state to try to get funding and also end user pay so that Louisiana has the defender system that they always should have going forward beyond COVID. I've been so both blown away in a negative way by how the system has still found a way to be enmeshed in the status quo despite the need to be thinking differently to save lives at this time. But I've also been so blown away in a positive way by how advocates, public defenders, among the chiefs among them, but obviously other folks have really stepped up to take on the task.
Yeah.
Is it right that that public defenders are not, I wouldn't say seeking fanfare, but that there isn't fanfare? I mean, just a question to the crew, is this an opportunity to actually show leaders, to show the people who we represent, and to show the general public that public defenders matter and are actually doing extraordinary things and are special for the greater goal and the greater good? I just throw that question out. There's something good about being modest, but I wonder if it's a missed opportunity.
It's interesting. Like, one of my very good friends is an immigration lawyer in New York, and before that she was public defender in New York. And just her experience with this, right, is like, I don't care who, I'm not focused on the attention. I'm doing this all. I mean, and it's true. It's completely because she feels called to it. That being said, I think it's important. This is a very opaque system, Scott. I think you in particular know that, like, when you're spending a lot of time trying to translate this in media, you realize how little people understand how this works. And so when we talk about decarceration, they think of it as transactional. A legislator or someone somewhere decides that they want to let people out, and people get out, right? But the steps it takes to get the people in power to care about people in prison, in jail, I mean, like, I've come around to the fact that, like, this is a lifetime of a fight. People are not gonna all care in 5-10 years even, because this is the fight, right? Making people care. And the people doing that are public defenders. So I think absolutely, in a moment where we're talking about essential workers and the values we place on the people who get so little attention, and, in this society and also in this economy, public defenders are absolutely on that list and deserve more of it. And I think about Louisiana, I think about Atlanta public defenders, I think about my friends in New Orleans and Little Rock and Sacramento, and it's just like, I can't even understand the depths of stress, tragedy, and strength it takes to actually make something like this, to endure a moment like this.
So this kind of bleeds
Sorry,
into.
you may have heard thunder in the background, but I actually think it makes me sound really cool and important. So I think you should just leave it in,
Well, it was also, don't worry, it was in all of our backgrounds. So
that's true.
We're all in Rap's living room.
It's
thundering
That's right.
It's like the
It's
word.
actually true that if it's thundering at my house, it probably is thundering at Rap's house. He lives right down the street.
Josie hit a button on the garage band.
Yeah.
Hit thunder.
Yeah.
Thunder sound.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow, I really need to learn to do that. That would be cool.
Sound effects.
Rap, can I answer Scott super quick too?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I appreciated Scott's question, because I think it's forward looking, and I mean, the reality is, like, when all this is said and done, like, we're all gonna have to look back and review how we acted, and it's a moral inventory of did I step up and would I help those around me? And to a person, every public defender I know exceeded whatever was asked of them. And the reason why I think that's important, besides just like lifting up people that acted heroically in difficult times, is that the thing that we've been talking about all session in your living room has been about what the potential power is of the relationship of the community and the movement with public defenders. And so there is a tactical, strategic value of lifting up public defenders and how they stretched out during this time, so that as this thing comes to an end and we enter a new era, the community knows who they could count on when they need it the most. And so being public about those stories, being outward facing about it, has strategic value if the end goal is building a movement for racial justice. So to answer Scott's question, I absolutely think from an organizer perspective, sharing these stories, what public defenders are doing, even beyond what people assume they're supposed to be doing, is really important.
Yeah. So I feel like I have to throw this last question out there because I want to get your answers. I'm going to ask you to keep it to a minute or so, because I know Illy is outside of this studio tapping her watch right now, counting the budget, which I appreciate.
We never want to make Illy upset. We will
No.
keep it to a minute.
She hears your
Hey,
apologies.
that wasn't Thunder. That was Illy.
That was Illy. That's right. That's right. But I listened to you bring up the furloughs in Louisiana. In Georgia, they're talking about significant budget cuts to public defenders. And I keep thinking to myself, it's not that we despise public defenders. It's that we really don't care about the people they serve, right? All of these cuts are about how little we care about justice for marginalized communities, low-income communities, communities of color. And I think because public defenders really understand that people they come to care about deeply are really despised in the criminal justice system, it wreaks havoc on them emotionally. And I talk to dozens of public defenders every day during this pandemic, and I will tell you they're tortured because every day they are asked to balance this sort of struggle between, do I demand going to court knowing that that's what my client needs to get justice? Do I go to the jail because my client needs to talk to me and I can't get them out? And also saying, I've got an elderly parent at home and I'm terrified that I might bring infection into my house, or I've got a child, and they're tortured. And they're trying to be client-centered, and they're trying to be good husbands and wives and children and parents. And so I just ask, what do you say to public defenders who are going through that real emotional trauma? What would you say to them as they struggle during these difficult times?
Go easy on yourself. I mean, go easy on yourself. We're all, before even, getting into being a public defender, everyone baseline is struggling with, work-life balance, that they have work, with joblessness, et cetera. And it's a stressful time not knowing what the future holds. And then to add to that, the kind of urgency of having people that you are actually representing, where, before it was life or death because a single moment in jail or charged is too much for, anyone to bear. But now it's like truly life or death, where a couple minutes could mean someone gets infected. I think we have to be, people just have to go, to the extent they can, easy on themselves and understand and know that they are doing everything they can, and that the fight is long. COVID will hopefully pass at some point, and there are a lot of people counting on them, but all they can do is what they can do. And what they can do is not just in court, but it's being healthy, being sane, being a good dad or a wife or a husband or partner, and also being good to themselves, because mental health, long-term physical health, will ultimately have a greater impact than just, a concentrated 2 months of doing more than anyone possibly could.
Other than sympathy, I can't imagine having to make that choice right now. And I have the luxury of being able to work from home right now. I mean, I actually always work from home, so very little has changed in my life other than the toddler running around. But, going outside at all right now feels enormously stressful, in part because I have a child with a respiratory illness who's at risk. And so the idea of having to make that choice and having taken on that level of responsibility out of belief that these people deserve an advocate, a voice, and to have their story told is, again, I think I said it in my first answer, but it's truly God's work. And I don't know I don't know what advice I would give. I think what I would say is just express my deep appreciation for this work. It's not just one client every time that someone stands up for one client, right? It's a shift of this system, and it may seem imperceptible, but it is real. I mean, what would we do without people fighting? So I don't have good advice, but I have, in exchange for advice, I have all the admiration in the world.
Raj, any closing thoughts for the public defenders out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I would say most is how much we honor the fact that they're struggling through that to even be a decision. I mean, it's such a revelation of character and integrity that people would feel a tugging and a pulling to go protect the community in court and in jail, and when people are getting out of jail at the risk of their own lives and the lives of people that are in their inner circles. So I don't think there's a clear, like, go this way in the fork of the road, but I guess what I'd want to say as a community member is how much we honor and salute the fact that you're struggling with this at your core. And I think it says so much about who public defenders are, what they are to the community. And lastly, I'd say that, like Josie was saying, is that this is going to be a sustained struggle. And we need you around, and we need you healthy. And for that reason, I hope that you take care of yourself just as you take care of the people.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think you all echoed an incredibly important theme, and that is that it's always going to be easy to feel defeated by all of the injustice that you can't get to. But if you remember it's a sustained struggle, and you remember that every day that you play a part to inch us a little closer to justice, and you have tens of thousands of colleagues and comrades inching a little closer as well, that is significant. And it is a sustained struggle.
Absolutely.
So I'm grateful for that message. Perfect parting words. So as I wrap up, I was saying that as I thought about this podcast, my first podcast, I thought I needed a good way to open and a good way to close, because that's what we learn as lawyers. You have to start strong and end strong. And as I was thinking of a closing, I really went back to my daughter's 5th grade year in elementary school. She was the student who did the morning announcements, and she on her own came up with her own closing. It was, "This is Aaliyah wrapping it up." And I can't do any better than that. So I am going to just say, I stole this from my daughter. Until we gather again, this is Jonathan Rapping, host of Gideon's Promise, the podcast, wrapping it up.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast, with Jonathan Rapping. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.